I have to leave now.
I understand. Be safe.
I will. Thank you.
Until next time.
Subscribe to Wild West Soul Stories. Hit the bell, like, comment, and share. Thanks for watching. The wagon dropped Rosemary Bennett at the end of the road where civilization seemed to stop and wilderness began. She stood there, holding a single carpetbag containing everything she owned in this world, watching the dust settle behind the departing wagon wheels. The driver had warned her 3 times that Caleb Stone did not welcome visitors. He had told her the rancher lived alone by choice and had not spoken to another soul in nearly 2 years except when absolutely necessary. Rosemary did not care about warnings. She had survived worse than a lonely rancher. She had survived watching her father drink himself to death after her mother passed. She had survived working in a boarding house where the owner treated her like property. She had survived 300 miles of traveling alone with nothing but prayers and desperation keeping her alive. The ranch house sat at the end of a long dirt path, surrounded by open land that stretched toward distant mountains. It was a modest structure, built with strong hands and sturdy wood, but neglected in the way places become when their owners stop caring about appearances. The fence needed mending. The porch steps sagged in the middle. Weeds grew thick around the foundation, but there was something about the place that whispered of potential, something that said it had once been loved and could be loved again. Rosemary walked the entire path with her chin held high despite the fear trembling in her chest. She had heard about Caleb Stone from a woman in town who remembered him from before the accident, before his wife and unborn child were taken from him in a river crossing gone wrong, before he retreated from the world and built walls around his heart that no one had been able to penetrate. She knocked on the door and waited. Nothing happened. She knocked again, harder this time, ignoring the way her knuckles ached against the rough wood. The door swung open so suddenly that she stumbled backward, nearly falling off the porch. The man standing in the doorway was tall and broad, with shoulders that seemed capable of carrying the weight of the entire sky. His hair was dark and unkempt, falling across a forehead lined with years of sun and sorrow. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and troubled and impossibly deep. He did not speak. He simply stared at her as if she were an apparition that might dissolve if he blinked. Rosemary found her voice before her courage could abandon her completely. "Mr. Stone? My name is Rosemary Bennett. I heard in town that you might need help around the property. I am a hard worker. I can cook and clean and tend animals. I am not afraid of difficult work, and I do not require much in terms of payment. Just a roof and meals would be sufficient until I can establish myself properly." Caleb Stone continued staring. His expression revealed nothing, but something shifted in those gray eyes. Something that might have been pain or might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. "Who sent you here?" His voice was rough from disuse, like a gate that had not been opened in too long. "No one sent me. I came on my own. You should not have." He started to close the door, but Rosemary stepped forward with a boldness that surprised even herself. "Please, I have nowhere else to go. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for the opportunity to work. I will prove my worth if you give me the chance." Caleb studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to all the broken places she tried so hard to hide. She wondered what he saw. A young woman with calloused hands and worn boots. A woman whose dress had been mended too many times to count. A woman whose eyes still held hope despite every reason to abandon it. "I do not need a servant," he said. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had prepared for rejection, had told herself she would simply find another option if this did not work. But standing here in the fading afternoon light, facing the reality of having nowhere to sleep and nothing to eat, the rejection felt crushing. She nodded slowly, already turning to leave.
"I understand. I apologize for disturbing you."
She had taken 3 steps toward the path when his voice stopped her. "I said I do not need a servant." Rosemary turned back. confused by the strange tone in his words. Caleb Stone stood in the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest, his expression still unreadable but somehow different than before. He was looking at her with something that resembled contemplation, as if he were solving a difficult problem in his mind. This ranch needs more than a servant can provide, he continued. It needs someone permanent, someone who will stay, someone who will care about whether the fence gets mended, and whether the garden grows, and whether the house feels like a home again. Rosemary did not understand what he was suggesting. I would care about those things. I would care about any place that gave me shelter. For how long? Until something better comes along? Until you save enough money to move to some city where life is easier. There is no easier life waiting for me anywhere, Mr. Stone. I have no family, no prospects, no one expecting me in any city or town. This is not a temporary situation for me, this is survival. Something in her words seemed to reach him. He uncrossed his arms and stepped out onto the porch, moving closer until only a few feet separated them. This close, she could see the lines around his mouth, the evidence of grief carried too long. She could see the way his hands bore scars from years of hard labor. She could see that beneath the rough exterior was a man who had once known how to be gentle. I am going to say something that will sound strange, Caleb said slowly, and I want you to listen before you react. Rosemary nodded, her heart suddenly beating faster. I do not need a servant, I need a wife. The words hung in the air between them like something fragile, something that might shatter if handled wrong. I know how that sounds, he continued before she could respond. I know you are a stranger, and I am a stranger to you. I know this is not how things are supposed to happen, but I have spent 2 years alone in this house, and I have learned something about loneliness that I did not understand before. Loneliness does not just hurt, it kills. Slowly, gradually, it takes everything that makes a man human and leaves behind only an empty shell. Rosemary stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, barely able to breathe. I am not asking for love, Caleb said. I am not asking for anything that you are not willing to give. I am asking for partnership, for companionship, for someone to share the burden of living when living feels too heavy to bear alone. I have land, I have a home, I have enough resources to provide a decent life. What I do not have is a reason to wake up in the morning. What I do not have is someone to share a meal with, someone to talk to when the silence becomes unbearable, someone to care whether I live or die. His voice cracked on the last words, revealing a vulnerability that transformed him from a frightening stranger into something much more human. You need work, I need a wife. Perhaps we can save each other. Rosemary should have been scandalized. She should have walked away from this unconventional proposal and found some other solution to her problems. But as she looked at Caleb Stone, she saw something that made her pause. She saw a reflection of her own loneliness. She saw a man who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep breathing anyway. I need time to think, she whispered. You have until morning. There is a spare room inside where you can sleep tonight, regardless of your decision. I will not turn you out into the dark. That night, Rosemary lay in a small bed in a small room that smelled of dust and neglect, and she thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her mother, who had died believing that love was worth any sacrifice. She thought about her father, who had died proving that grief could consume a person entirely. She thought about the years she had spent working for people who never saw her as anything more than a useful tool. And she thought about Caleb Stone, standing in the doorway with his storm-gray eyes, offering her something she had never dared to imagine. A home, a partnership, a chance to belong somewhere. When morning came, Rosemary walked into the kitchen where Caleb sat at a wooden table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the question in his eyes before he could speak it aloud. "Yes," she said simply, "I will marry you." The wedding took place 3 days later in a small church in town. The preacher seemed confused by the quiet couple who spoke their vows with such solemnity, but he performed the ceremony without question. Rosemary wore a simple dress she had borrowed from a kind shopkeeper's wife. Caleb wore the same clothes he always wore, but he had shaved and combed his hair in a way that made him look almost handsome. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb looked at Rosemary with an expression that seemed to say, "What have we done?" But there was also relief in his eyes, as if he had finally set down a burden he had been carrying too long. The first months were awkward. They moved around each other carefully, politely, like two people sharing a house by accident. Caleb worked the land from sunrise to sunset, and Rosemary transformed the neglected house into something warm and welcoming. She mended the curd. Ains. She planted a garden. She learned to cook the foods he liked, and to recognize the sounds of his footsteps when he returned in the evening. They ate meals together in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging words about the weather or the animals or the work that needed doing. It was not the passionate romance that poems described, but it was something. It was connection. It was shared existence. It was two lonely people learning to be lonely together. The change happened so gradually that neither of them noticed it at first. Caleb began coming home earlier, finding reasons to work closer to the house where he could hear Rosemary singing while she cooked. Rosemary began looking forward to the sound of his boots on the porch, feeling a warmth spread through her chest when she heard him approaching. One evening, a storm rolled in with violent thunder and lightning that shook the entire house. Rosemary had always been frightened of storms, a fear left over from childhood that she had never been able to overcome. She sat in the kitchen with her arms wrapped around herself, trying to pretend she was fine. Caleb found her there, trembling in her chair, and without a word he sat down beside her. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply stayed, his presence solid and reassuring in the chaos of the storm. When a particularly loud crack of thunder made her gasp, he finally reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused, warm against her cold fingers. She gripped his hand tightly and held on until the storm passed. When the morning sun revealed that the world was still intact, something between them had shifted. The careful distance they had maintained began to dissolve. Caleb started touching her in small ways, a hand on her shoulder, a brush of fingers when passing the bread. Rosemary started looking at him differently, seeing not just a partner but a man with kind eyes and gentle hands and a heart that was slowly learning to beat again. One night, Caleb came home with a small wildflower picked from the field. He placed it on the table in front of her without explanation, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Rosemary stared at the flower as if it were the most precious gift she had ever received. In a way, it was, "Thank you," she said softly. "It reminded me of you," he mumbled, looking away. Delicate but strong, beautiful in its own quiet way. Rosemary felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever called her beautiful before. No one had ever looked at her the way Caleb was looking at her now, with something that resembled wonder. The first time he kissed her, they were standing on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and gold, and the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of night. Caleb turned to her with something urgent in his expression, something he had clearly been holding back for too long. "Rosemary," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "Yes, I told you I was not asking for love. When I proposed this arrangement, I thought love was something that had died with..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I thought I would never feel anything again. I thought my heart was too damaged to ever work properly." Rosemary waited, barely breathing. "I was wrong." His voice was hoarse wit. Emotion. "What I feel for you is not the desperate, consuming love of youth. It is something deeper. something that has grown slowly, rooted in shared days and quiet moments and the simple miracle of not being alone anymore. He reached up and touched her face with trembling fingers, tracing the curve of her cheek as if memorizing her features. "I love you," he said. "I love you in a way I did not know I was capable of loving. I love you for saving me from myself, for bringing light back into this house, for making me believe that life was worth living again." The kiss that followed was soft and tentative, two wounded souls reaching for each other in the fading light. Rosemary tasted salt and realized they were both crying. Tears of relief, tears of gratitude, tears of joy. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "I did not know what love felt like until I found it here, with you, in this place that was supposed to be just a temporary solution." Caleb pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as if he never intended to let go. "This is your home now, for as long as you want it, for as long as you want me. Forever," Rosemary said. "I want it forever." Years later, when their children played in the yard and the house rang with laughter and noise, Rosemary would sometimes stand on that same porch and remember the frightened young woman who had knocked on a stranger's door begging for work. She would remember Caleb's unexpected proposal and her own leap of faith and all the small moments that had built their love brick by brick. She had come asking for work. He had offered her something far more valuable. He had offered her a life, and together and that ranch at the edge of civilization. They had created something neither of them had dared to hope for. They had created a family. They had created a home. They had created a love story that would be whispered about for generations. The tale of the lone cowboy who asked a stranger to be his wife, and the woman who was brave enough to say yes.